Okay, Kabalti. So we are right at the top. The Gemara taught us that the reason why we know, I believe it's Rabashi who told us that the reason why we know that Basar v'chalav is Asur ba'achila is because it says L'sachel kol ta'eva, we dashed kol shati aftilach. Anything that I said is not good for you, is bad for you, you stay away from. It will be Asur ba'achila. I said that Basar v'chalav is not good for you. Therefore, Basar v'chalav will be Asur b'achila. Correct the Gemara. So by the same token, Maises Shabbos listeru. Anytime someone does something Issur on Shabbos, it should be Asur. So Rashi tells us a specific case. Kigoyin hamavashul b'Shabbos. If someone cooks on Shabbos, litzeru b'achila l'chol Yisrael. It should be Asur achila for everybody in Klal Yisrael. The ha his articha. I warned you when I told you lo yisaychal kol te'eva l'sayvoy to completely distance yourself from anything that came out through something that Hashem says you should stay away from. But we know that's not halacha because if he was over Shabbos b'mezid, it's only prohibited for him to eat. That's not midoraisa. That's not allowed. That's just midorabanan. But anybody else would be able to eat the ma'aser Shabbos of somebody else. So Zok to Gemara. For Shabbos, there's an exception. Omar Kra, the Torah says by Shabbos, Ki Kodesh Hi Lachem. Ushamartim is HaShabbos Ki Kodesh Hi Lachem. The Shabbos itself is Kodesh. Kedusha is Asur B'Hanaa. Hi Kodesh, Ve'in Ma'aseh HaKodesh. The Ma'aseh Shabbos, the Torah is giving us a special limud that the Ma'aseh of Shabbos will not be Asur. Zok to Gemara, if that's the case, what about Choyesh B'Shoru B'Chamor? It says, L'shach Shor B'Shoru B'Chamor Yachtov. If you made charisha with klayim, that's you're not allowed to do. Shouldn't the zroyim be also? Or v'choisim pi para b'doshba? Or if it says le'sachsum shor b'dishay, and you're not allowed to muzzle an animal when he's working for you amongst grain, you did that. Maybe all that grain should be also. It's also something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said is prohibited. Zokt Rashi, Litzeru, Hazroyim, Vadisha, which is the product of this Maisa Issur. Tahechakticha man, Kol Hanach, the Ka'amar, all the things that I said you should stay away from, Litzeru Bachilu Vana, their product should be Asur Bachilu Vana, Ka'amar the Litzeru. Rashi is going to point out later in the Sugya, there was never a discussion that maybe if you were over this Avera, you were Chosim Para, maybe the par itself should be us. Rashi is going to tell us later that that's never a havamina in the Gemara. We never thought that Torah should become us. The product of the Issur, that's what we're suggesting should be us. Zok Gemara, I'll tell you why those aren't us. Because Hashta, Umar Shabbos, the Chamira, Madach Shabbos, which is more Chomer, at least, the Issur Skila. Nevertheless, Maiseh Mutar, and the Torah taught us, Kodesh Shilachem, He Kodesh Veid myself. Kodesh, Hani Lakol Shegin. These are Mir Lavin. Mir Lavin surely would not answer. So then it goes back to square one. So Basar B'Chalav is a Mir Lav. So why is it that the product does become answer? So that's Rashi's question. So Zuk Rashi, Hani Lakol Shegin. Although Basar B'Chalav, you don't have that problem. I'm reading Haikal V'Chomer. You know why? Whatever I said, you must stay away from. You're not allowed to eat that. Umistavra the Issura de Kra Alea Ka'amar. The Torah is talking about when the Issur is on the item itself, not on the tools that created the item. The Ha'achel To'eva Gupa. The prohibition is to eat the actual To'eva. But you're eating Basar B'Chalav. You're not eating the product of an Aveira. You're actually eating the Aveira itself. That's where the Torah says don't eat it. Aval Hai Lo Yachol HaCharisha Atzma. The Lo Yachol really is the Charisha Atzma. That's the Te'eva. It's Hai Lo Yachol HaCharisha Atzma. Sorry, here, he's not eating the Charisha. We're discussing eating the product of the Charisha. Elaba Mimena. V'achosim v'adosh nami. Lav chasim gufa ka'achel. So when it's similar to Shabbos, where the item is not the davar or Issur itself, rather it's a product of the Issur, that you could learn from Shabbos that the product of the Issur will not become Usr. The Issur is only Usr and covered by the Loiseichel Kol Te'eva if the Issur itself is what you're eating. But by Basar v'Cholim, where the Basar v'Cholim itself is the Issur, that's where the Issur Achila. Zok Gemara, okay. What about Klai's Royal? There, it's the actual Klaim that should be Usr. Litzeru. Dati Afti Lach Hu. Zok Gemara, true. But Midagoli Rachmana Gabi Klai Akera. So Klai's Royal is mixing, let's say, Chita and Sa'ira together. Where it is Usr Bana, that's Klai Akera. If you mixed it with grape seeds, that's when it becomes Usr. So frankly, more, but why isn't Klai's Royal Usr as well? Litzeru. Dati Afti Lachu. So Gemara the Goli Rachmana Gabi Klai Akerem. Pen Tikdash, and we darshan Tikdash is two words. Pen Tukaresh, you have to burn it. So the Torah tells us Dafka by Klai Akerem, you have to burn it. Mechlal, the Klai's Royim Sharu, it to tell us that yes, there is a rule of Lo Yisoichel Kol Te'eva, but here the Torah was Megala. The only time there's an Issur Hanaa is by Klai Hakerem. But Klai's Royim, there's no Issur. So okay, so that takes care of Klai's Royim. The Ema Klai Kerem Asurin Bein Ba'Achila Bein B'Hanaa. So Klai Kerem, let's say, is it says Pendikdash by Klai Kerem to tell you that Klai's Royim is not so chal. So maybe Klai Kerem is Asur Saiba Achila and Saiba Hanaa. That's Tukaresh, you have to burn it. But Klai's Royim will still be Ba'Achila Asuri Hanaa Shari. Because if you're telling me that Klai's Royim does fall under the category of L'Sotzcha Kol Te'eva, because you're eating the Issur itself, it's just that the Torah was Magala that by Klai Kerem it's more severe. So we have levels of severity. By Klai Kerem it's Asur Bein Ba'Achila Bein B'Hanaa. But by Klai's Royim, it could still be Asur Ba'Achila. So Gemara, no, we have another limud. Klai's Royim is Ishkish L'Klai Behema. It's compared to Klaim of a Behema, where the Torah specifically says that it's Mutter Ba'Achila. Tichsiv Behemtecha Lois Arbia Kalayim, and it says Sotcha Lois Isra Kalayim. So they're compared in one pasuk, and we darshan Ma Behemtecha Hayoytze Mimenu Mutaris. Just like your Behema, its product, the product of Kalayim, is mutter. You're not allowed to breed Kalayim, but you're allowed to use and enjoy Kalay Behema. Av Sotcha Hayoytze Mimenu Mutter. So too your field, if you planted Kalayim, the growth will be. How do we know that Klaim of a behema is going to be mutter? How do we know that you're allowed to use a mule? The Torah specifically says you're not allowed to use Klaim to be brought as a carbon. The halal, it must be the lahedjit shari, because if it's even also for a hedjit, you surely couldn't bring it for a carbon. Where does the Torah tell us that Kalayim is Osir? So Rashi quotes a pasuk. Kalayim Asir L'Gvaya, the Tanya Shor, Oy Kesef, Oy Eis, and we darshan in our Masechta, Daf Chesed and Beis, Prat L'Kalayim. So if the Torah is telling you you can't use it for Kalayim, that in and of itself is proof positive that it is mutter to use Lahed. Zok to Gemara. What about Oisov Espinoi? Oisov Espinoi, once again, it's a product of an Issur. Maybe you shouldn't be allowed to eat it. Litzar Zok to Gemara. Zok to Gemara, no. Really, Oisov Espinoi, Rashi says, it's not a whole new Issur, it's Mechusar Zman, meaning the second of the pair is not yet of the proper age to be able to be shechted, because its mother or its son was shechted that day. It's a standard Mechusar Zman, so we could compare it to the place where the Torah specifically outlaws Mechusar Zman. Where is that? Since the Torah said you cannot bring a carbon that's Mechusar Zman, If it's not 8 days old or any time it's not timed out yet, you can't bring it as a carbon. Michlal the lahedit shari. Once again, it's proof that lahedit mechusus man is not a problem, and therefore oisay vespenoi wouldn't make it also. Okay. How about shiluch hakein? Shiluch hakein liktza. Dr. Gemara, if the mother bird was also, now you're sending it away, that means somebody is going to pick up this bird somewhere. It's going to be in the wild. Somebody might catch it. And they're going to catch an animal that has an Issur. No. The Torah would never have told us to send away a bird and then create a public menace because now someone might capture it. Now, this Nukuda here is where Rashi hammers home the point that the Dover HaAsur is the problem. So let's have a look at Rashi. Loy Amr Torah, I'm sorry, Shiluch HaKein Litza. So Rashi says, what does it mean, Shiluch HaKein Litza? If you already violated, it says, and you've already violated it because you took the mother. And now you're coming to Bezin to ask, what should I do? How do I fix this? Now we know Shiluch HaKein is considered a lavalidik lasei. And what did we tell him to do? So send the mother away now. V'chayvnuhu l'shaleach. Kiditnan l'kamon mishaleach ve'inaloik. On the Afkut Memalef, in the parak of Shiluch HaKein, we'll learn that if you violated and took the mother, you don't get malchus because you could make Shiluch HaKein now. But Vibalt, you already did an Issur with the mother. You violated the Issur of Loisika Chem Abonim. So maybe Te Asur Lachila, now this mother should be Asur Lachila Oilamis. And therefore, even though it said that in the wild, she'll be Oshabana. On that, the Gemara answers, like Amr Torah Shalech with Akala. The Khan, Hari Amr Shalech. We're telling you, you have to send it away. If it's Oshabana, the Torah would have never told you to send it away. That's why it's a lavanidik lasei. The imlok kafta. If you took it wrongfully and you're over the avera, chazar v'sholcha. Now turn around and send it away. If this bird was also the Torah would have never told you shalchena, send it away for yichshulu ba b'nei. Zokt Rashi v'hu adin the motzil memar nami b'chol hani ma Shabbos techamira. The Gemara could have answered over here. You know why Shalich HaKein is not Usur? Because you have the Kalachim from Shabbos. However, if we have a direct svara in this actual Indian, the Gemara prefers to say the direct svara. By Shalich HaKein, we had a direct svara that the Torah wouldn't say Shalech L'Takal. So therefore, umidu the Mashlich Piruka Migufein Lo Yalef Me'achrin. We're not going to compare it to Shabbos. That's one lashon of Rashi. But Rashi has a second lashon which Rashi prefers, and that is very, very important to understand. Lishna Chunzak Rashi. Shiluch HaKein litzar kol shiluch HaKein litzar. Not just if you first violated the Issur and took the mother, but the moment the Torah says separate yourself from this bird, shalech the shalach hasaim, that itself should create Issur and off, even before you were over in the there. Because kol shetiyaftaloch means anything that I told you to separate from, whether it's Issur or not. So Zok Rashi, litzar kol shiluch HaKein litzar. Ha'eim la'olam, the mother should always be us. Ba'afilu shilcha, even if you never did anything wrong and you followed it by the book. The kol shetiaftiloch hareyu loch la'olam b'valtaycha. The moment I said you should separate yourself from this bird, shalech, the shalach, that in itself would create the Issur lo'isaycha. At the moment where you find this nest, I've told you that the mother is prohibited to you. You must send it away. And therefore, even without an Aveira occurring, the mere fact that the Torah said separate yourself from it, that will trigger the loisaycha. Zok Rashi, I like this shot better. V'zed nearly ikr. Why? The haloi kamer Ravashi. Ravashi never said the chol dover should never deboy Aveira. With chilahu muter aser. Ravashi didn't say anything that an Aveira was done with it. And beforehand there was muter, that's bival toicha. He didn't say that. He said anything that the Torah told you to separate from, whether an Aveira was committed with it or not. And I'll prove it to you, Zok Rashi. Because if it's only something that an Issur was done with it, well then imkein acharish b'shar v'chamor v'marbia klayin all those cases cited earlier on this Amud, Yeshra Behemoth, the Behemoth should be also, because you did the Issur with the Behemoth. Elamai, it has nothing to do with the Issur. It has to do with something that Hashem told you to stay away from. The Gemara never asked the question as to why the animal is not Issur. That was never the Havamina. The whole Shaila was the product of this Issur is what you should be prohibited to eat. So therefore, it's logical to say that anything that Torah tells you to separate yourself from, it has nothing to do with whether or not an Avera was done. It's just the actual item is what the Torah is saying to stay away. So that just gives us a little clarity in what Lo Yisaychal Kol Toyeva is referring to. Amar Shlokish, Zok Shlokish, Minayin Lebasa B'Cholov She'Oser. So we already went through a whole shtickle according to Rabashi, because Lo Yisaychal Kol Toyeva, but Rish Lakish has a different approach. How do I know Basa B'Cholov is Oser? So the Gemara Talmud Leimer Al Toichlu B'Menu No Uvashel Mavusha. You're not allowed to eat the korban Pesach raw, or if it's cooked. You have to eat it dafka kiyim tzliyesh. Why couldn't it say Al Toichlu B'Menu No Ubushel B'Mayim? What's the double losh in the Bashel Mavushel? Shein Talmud Leimer Mavushel. Ma Talmud Leimer Mavushel. Leimer to reveal to us a new secret of the Torah. Yesh Lach Bishel Acher Shehu Kazeh. There's another type of bishul that creates Issur as well. Cooking a korban Pesach creates Issur, but there's another type of cooking that creates Issur. The Torah is being maramis to be'ezeh zebosher v'chalav, and from the korban Pesach that's cooked that becomes Issur. From there we know that bosher v'chalav is. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan. Why do you need your pshat Rish Lakish? Where the debate? Who asked you to come up with a new innovative pshat? What's wrong with the universal pshat that we're all familiar with? Why do you have to make your own Torah? Turning on to Amud Beis. Is there anything wrong with what Rebbe taught us? Rashi, Mishnezu, Shoshana Rebbe, Velomda, Labasa B'Chalav and Mikras. Is there anything wrong with what Rebbe already taught us? How we know that Basar B'Chalav is Asr? What does it say? It says Lo Yisaych Lenu. Now Lo Yisaych Lenu is not in the parsha of Basar B'Chalav. The pasuk says, Rashi says Lo Yisaych Lenu Yisera Tichsiv B'Ra'ei Anoich. In Parshas Ra'ei, it says Gabe Psulei HaMikdashim Sheniftu. The subject matter are Psulei Mikdashim that were redeemed. The pasuk says Rak Hadam Lo Yisaychelu Al Ha'aretz Tishbechenu Kamoyim, and then the pasuk repeats it again later in the pasuk. So why is there an extra clause, a repetition of the Lo Yisaychlenu in the parsha of Psulei Mikdashim? Ledam lo yitrich. I definitely don't need the pasuk to tell me that it's prohibited. Tidam doksivi kroy tuva. There's many psukim that tell us one may not eat dam. So there's an extra lo yisaychlenu. So Rebbe told us this lo yisaychlenu mukile lebasar b'chalav is referring to basar b'chalav. So we already have a very beautiful limit from Rebbe. So why, Rish Lakish, did you feel the need to create a new limit? Basar b'chalav because of medaber. Are you sure it's possible to call a fact, Rabbi? Because of a daber? Maybe the Lashachlan is referring to some other issue. Amrit, Seyu Lamad, Miyud Gilbul Midois, Shatorah Nidrashes Behem. Why don't you look at the famous Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel that teaches us the 13 ways to darshan the Torah? It says, Dover Alamad bin Yanoi. Dover Lamed bin Yanai, Dover Lamed b'Soifai, v'chein Shnei Kshuva P'chitz Zeh Achila Kasav Ashlizi v'Chir B'nei. So what is the Dover Lamed bin Yanai? I don't think I said that right. Let me quickly bring up the Brisa. Something doesn't make sense about what I just said. Let me look at it. Let me just pull the actual nusach itself. Into the price. So here we go. It says Dover Lamed Binoni v'Dover Lamed Sofer. So that's an independent item. That's a separate item. So Dover Lamed Binoni v'Dover Lamed Sofer. That's an independent item. You can learn what a pasuk is talking about by its context. So let's look at the context of this pasuk of Lo Sheichlam. By Mechos V'Daber, B'Shnei Minin. It's talking about two different species. Rashi says, what two species are we referring to when we're talking about Psula Mikdoshim? So Rashi says, Shnei Minim, some are mutter b'achila, but also b'gizav avoda. Right? If you redeem kachim that had a mum, you're only allowed to eat them. You're not allowed to work with them. You're not allowed to shear them. So it's like a hybrid. It's referring to something that's mutter b'achila, but also begizav avoda. So Vivaldi is speaking about two different meaning. Chances are that Lo Sheichlan is also referring to two meaning, such as Basar b'cholov, which is two separate meaning coming together. It's a little bit of a fuzzy logic type of davar lamed bin yodli, but the Gemara tells us that's how you darshan. So b'mekos v'daber b'shnei meaning, afkan b'shnei meaning. So I explained like Rashi. Rashi is the reason why that pasuk was speaking about shnei meaning, because it's referring to psulei medoshim sheniftu, which has a hybrid halacha. It's muter b'achila, but also b'gizav avod. Tosfos actually doesn't like Rashi's pshat because that's not a meaning, that's a split halacha. So Tosfos says it's because psulei mikdoshim are compared to tzviva ayil, because the Torah says you should treat psulei mikdoshim like tzviva ayil. You're allowed to eat with tamei. So the two meanings of Tosfos are tzviva ayil that the Torah compares it to. So it's two meanings. Tzviva ayil will compare it to basar b'cholov, which are two different meanings. So Zok Reish Lakish, you know why I didn't rely on Rebbe's pshat? Yes, we do have the Lo Sheichlan to tell you that it's Asur ba'achila. Basar b'cholov will be Asur b'achila. Agreed. But Zok Reish Lakish, imiyahi havamini hanimini ba'achila. That's only in Israel achila, Lo Sheichlan. Avol b'hanaa, b'hechatesi would be Asur b'hanaa. Well, I would not know that. The Baal Shmuel, I need to learn from Korban Pesach that it's Asur b'hanaa. Is Korban Pesach that was cooked Asur b'hanaa? Let's see Rashi. Al b'hanaa loy kamash mulon mehai kor d'ksiva asar didei gabi Pesach. Ma Pesach mevushal Asur b'achila uva. Just like a Korban Pesach, if you cooked it, it would be Asur b'achila and hana. Why would, if you cook a Korban Pesach, yes, you're not allowed to eat it. And mehechet takes it that it's Asur b'hanaa. So Rashi, the whole kachim she'enam ru'uyim la'achila. What do you do if you have a carbon that you're not allowed to eat? You have to wait till it becomes noiser, and once it becomes noiser, it's also by law. You must burn it to ubar churasa b'yetzulavesasreifa. Therefore, after asher. So it's not really mamish asher b'no. By default, it becomes asher b'no because you're going to have to wait until it becomes noiser, and once it becomes noiser, then it must be burnt. So therefore, it's a sort of indirect way of being asher b'no. But nevertheless, from Korban Pesach, we're comparing Korban Pesach to Basar b'cholov, we can also learn that it's Asur b'hanaa. So Zok Reish Lakish, I love what Rabbi said, but that only takes us halfway. It shows us the Issur Achila. I needed to also see Israel. Beautiful. But for Rabbi b'hanaa, Rabbi didn't quote Reish Lakish's Mikar from Korban Pesach. Rabbi just says it's Lo Sheichlan. So how does Rabbi know that in fact Basar b'cholov is Asur b'hanaa? So according to Nafkal up, you didn't possible. Nemer kan ki am kodesh ata l'Hashem alekecha. Let's see the pasuk inside by the Issur Nevela. It says lo yisoichlu kol nevela lager asher b'sharecha titnenu v'achala oy mechar l'nochri. Right, that was the pasuk we discussed at the end of yesterday. Ki am kodesh ata l'Hashem alekecha. Because you're an am kodesh, and then right after that lo yisavashal gedi b'chalayvim. So there's a connection between ki am kodesh ata to lo yisavashal gedi b'chalayvim. Zok Rebbe kiyam kodesh ata. V'nemer lahalo that says regarding prostitution, v'lo kadesh b'vnei Yisrael. The pasuk says lo yisiyah kadesha b'vnei Yisrael v'lo kadesh b'vnei Yisrael. I believe we just learned that yesterday in Parshas Kiseitze. Ma la'alon bano. Just like when we're answering prostitution, it's pleasure. It's not eating. You're not eating it. It's pleasure. Afkan bano. So too. Here also, it's Osir Bando by Basar B'chol. There's a famous story with a woman who went crying to Rabbik, and she said, Rabbik, Manzine Gvara Mishiga, my son went crazy. She says, what was it? She says, tanzt mit Shikses in an Est Chazer. So Rabbik looks at her and tells her, Danzine in this Mishiga is a Baltave. Wenn die suchst mich, als tanzt mit Chazaydim in der Est Shikses, dus is Mishiga. Aber dus, als tanzt mit Shikses in Est Chazaydim, dus macht dem nur for a Baltave. That was the famous story of Rabbik. Now, we mentioned a moment ago the Brisa of Rabbi Yishmael. So I just want to share a tidbit from the Satmar Rebbe. The Satmar Rebbe was not a public speaker, but in the 50s, where the Sheres of Plata, who married right after the war, were now making bar mitzvah their children, he got pressure to come to a bar mitzvah that was the first child of a Sheres of Plata couple, and they went through so much and were such a difficulty, so they begged him to attend the bar mitzvah to be machazer. So he said, how could I turn such a situation down? So he came to the bar mitzvah, and then they asked him to speak, and he said, I'm not a speaker, I don't speak, but they were pressuring him. So he said, you know what, I'll just talk to the bar mitzvah boy, I'll give him a little message. And he told the bar mitzvah boy, how does someone steig in learning? You're ma Brits now, you're going to be learning more. How do you steig in learning? So he says, we say a brisa from Rabbi Shmuel, he taught us. And Rabbi Shmuel taught us, how could you succeed in learning? With midas toivos. If you'll be about midas, then you'll succeed in learning. And then he said, and I want you to know something else that you should know about Rabbi Shmuel, who tells us about the key to limud Torah. Rabbi Shmuel always showed up before Psukkah de Zimmer, as the brisa is always before Psukkah de Zimmer. Zok the Gemara weiter. So he always showed up on time to die. Let's see the Gemara weiter. Dvei Rabbi Elazar taught. Dvei Rabbi Elazar had another source for the Issur of Basar B'cholav. Says lo seichlu kol nevela. One may not eat nevela. Omer Torah, the Torah says, kishatim karena, when you sell it, because what does the Torah say? Lo seichlu kol nevela. What should you do with it? It's lager shebesharecha tetnena v'achala oy v'chor l'noch. So you're clearly allowed to have Hanaa from the vela. You're allowed to sell it to a guy. But kishatim karena, when you sell it to a guy, loisiv ashlana v'sim karena. It says you could sell it, but don't prepare it and cook it and then sell it. So that's how we learn. Right after the pasuk of Basar B'cholav, it tells the nevela you sell it. To hit us, sell the nevela as is. Don't sell the nevela cooked with cholav, because then you wouldn't be able to have enough from it. You wouldn't be allowed to sell. The very Shmuel Tana, it says loy sevashel gedi b'chalev imoy gimel pam. Why does the Torah repeat the same Issur 3 times? Echad l'Issur Achila, ve'echad l'Issur Hanaa, ve'echad l'Issur Bishul. One to prohibit cooking, one to prohibit eating the product of such a Issur. One is to Asur Hanaa. Tanya Isi ben Yehuda Minayin lebashel Basar B'cholav she'asur. How do you know that if you cook Basar B'cholav that it's going to be asur? And I believe he's talking about Issur Achila. Like we said earlier, by the Torah's prohibition to eat treifa, the Torah also says Anshe Kodesh, and there the Torah explicitly states Lo Yisaychem. Mal just like Basar treifa, Asur B'Achila, Afkan Asur B'Achila. Vein Li'ala B'Achila. So we only see from Basar B'Sad Treifa that Basar B'cholav is Asur B'Achila. But no minayin, so Amrit Kal V'chayim. And here it's a little bit complicated. So we have to focus. Uma Orla, Madak Orla. Now the first 3 years that a fruit grows, it's Asur B'Hanaa. But Shalom Nevda B'Aver, no Aver was done with Orla. It was planted fair and square. Everything was Kalacha. It just happened to be that the first 3 years of growth the Torah prohibits. Nevertheless, Asur B'Hanaa. So Basar B'cholav, which is even worse than Orla, Shenevda Ba'avera. And Avera was done with Basar B'cholav. Einoitin, Asur B'Hanaa. Wouldn't it be logical to say that surely that should also be Asur B'Hanaa? So tomorrow that's not a good kavachomer because Marla Arla shekei loy hoysel shasa kosher. Arla is much more chomer than Basar b'cholov because Arla was never mutter from its very creation. Basar b'cholov, each item was perfectly mutter. It became Basar. So maybe there wouldn't be an Issur on such a type of Issur. But
there's what the Arla will become mutter. It's the
Arla will never become mutter. The next year pairs are mutter. These Arla remain Asher forever.
So these
fruit are Asher forever.
Basar b'cholav was once mutter and now it's going to be Asher once. And this Arla is the opposite. It was once Asher, it's going to become mutter.
No, it won't. The next year's pairs will be mutter. But these pairs that grew the first year remain Asher forever.
Those pairs may have not. Next year, it could be the same pairs that just ripen.
They'll rot, they'll fall off the tree, and then next year there'll be new pairs.
Okay, what about pairs that last longer than 1 year?
They're Asher forever. Orla stays Asher forever. Those actual pairs.
So sure, an esrig is supposed to be last year after year, on the same tree.
That's true. An esrog could stay on the tree for longer, but those that were created during the first 3 years, you're not allowed to use, even the next year.
So how do you ever have an esrog that you can use?
But because after the third crop, it's now sprouts fresh. There might be some residual leftover esrogim from previous years, but that doesn't mean new esrogim won't.
So you have to identify those.
You probably do. That's why we pay so much, because of the identification process.
Right.
You know, it's interesting. There used to be a book in the washroom of the Philadelphia Yeshiva, and it was a book that explained how they do things that you don't understand how they do, like a ship in a bottle. So there was a certain type of whiskey that there was a full-grown pear in the bottle. And they asked, how do they do this? So they explained that they would go to the pear orchard and they would put bottles over the sprouting pears and they would actually grow inside the bottle. I'm pretty sure that in esrog orchards, they actually put sheaths around the esrogim because they don't want the esrog to get damaged, its skin to get hit by a leaf to avoid blood flow. So they actually do baby each individual fruit. So they ought to know when it grew. Now, we know they're Asher B'Hanaa, but we don't know that we're not buying them.
We don't know what?
That we're not actually buying them.
Oh.
We hope that we're not buying them. Okay, so Zog the Gemara weiter. So Zog the Gemara, Chametz v'Pesach Yechiach, Shahayzel L'Shasa Kosher, before it was Chametz or before it was Pesach, Yosy B'Hanaa. Zog Gemara, but you can't bring a right from Chametz v'Pesach either. Mal Chametz v'Pesach, Shekein Onish Kares, that has a huge Chumrah. There's a Chi of Kares on it. Zog the Gemara, so let's bring in a third fact. Now let's stop a second. Why did the Gemara here now run to Klaya Kerem? We started off with Orla and with Chametz v'Pesach, and we asked Malach Chametz v'Pesach is on the Shkaretz. So the Gemara should have went back, but Orla is not on the Shkaretz. Why did the Gemara need to jump now to Klaya Kerem? Orla, between the first two items, Chametz v'Pesach and Orla, you have all the proof you need, because if you say Mal Pesach, it's Chayiv Kares, Arla Yachiach. If you say Mal Orla, Shkin Loy Hashel Shetz Kosher, Pesach Yachiach. Loy Rozeh Karoizah Tzara Shabbos Shaben, that they're Asher B'Hanaa. So why do I need Klaya Kerem? That's a good kasha that the Gemara is going to ask shortly. But let's move on. Frank Gemara, Lama Li Gzeir Shava, Laisi Kula B'Kavachomer Me'Arla. Why do we need Gzeir Shava? What was your Gzeir Shava? Your Gzeir Shava was that it's Asher B'Achila. We know it from a Basar B'Treif, the Treif Loy Shechet. From Orla, we should be able to learn side that it's Asher B'Achila, and side that it's Asher B'Hanaa. So once you have a Kavachomer to say that there's an Issur Hanaa from Orla, well, then you can use that same Kavachomer to create an Issur Achila. Like to Kula Kavachomer me Orla. My Orla Shaloi Nevda Ba'Aveira. Asura Bein B'Achila Bein B'Hanaa. Basar B'Cholov Shenevda Ba'Aveira. Eino Din She'Asur Bein B'Achila Bein B'Hanaa. Zok to Gemara. The reason why we didn't rely fully on the Kal V'chomer, and we also needed the Gzeir Shava, is because the Kal V'chomer does have a weak point. It has a fault. Mishum the Ikal Meimar, you could have slugged up this Kal V'chomer by saying Choresh B'Shor Uvachamor, one Issur, or Choysen Pipara, another Issur, V'Dachma, Yochiach. To bring a raya from there that it shouldn't be Asur B'Achila. Shenevdo B'Hem Avim. In both those cases, an Avera was committed, V'Shor, but even Mutar B'Achila. So therefore, you wouldn't be able to use the Kal V'chomer to say that it's Asur B'Achila, because you have examples of things that an issue was done, yet it's not Asur B'Achila. So therefore, we need to add the Gzeir Shava. Once the Gzeir Shava is in place, it tells us obviously to ignore Chayrish B'Shor V'Chamor Yachtov, and it tells us to ignore Choysen Pipar, because the Gzeir Shava trumps that. Once we're told to ignore, now we can use the Kal V'chomer to extend that to the Issur Hanaa as well. So the Gemara, getting back to what we had a minute ago, when we add a kasha, Malach Korban Pesach, Malach Chometz Pesach, that it has a Shasa Kosher, that has a Chi of Kares. Why did the Gemara jump to a third halach of Klai HaKerem? Why didn't the Gemara stay within what it was talking about? And it could have said Lema Arla Teichiach, because Arla is not Chayiv Kares, yet there's still Issur Hanaa. We could have made a matzad, learning it up, combined from Chometz Pesach and Arla. Amar Ravashi, because there was a problem with the Tzad HaShava, with the matzad, combined Arla and Korban and Chometz Pesach. From the Ikal Meimar, Nevela Techir. We could have slugged up the matzad with Nevela. Jasur B'Achila. Nevela is also Asur B'Achila, but it's Muteres B'Hanaa. So therefore, you're right, you have Chometz Pesach. That's Asur B'Achila B'Hanaa. And you have Arla. That's Asur B'Achila B'Hanaa. But on the other hand, you have Nevela. That's only Asur B'Achila and not B'Hanaa. And therefore, you cannot rely on the matzah. But once you bring Klayim into the picture, then it helps us. We need to know exactly how Klayim would help us. You could still say Nevela Techiach, Shasura B'Achilu B'Hanaa. But we're going to get to that in a second. And now we're going to learn a very yesodistic halacha. We know there's something called the Kal V'chomer. We know there's something called the matzad. And sometimes you need three together, like Orla, Chometz Pesach, and Klayim, working together, which is what we're doing over here. And they each have individual rules as to how you could neutralize or refute them. And now we're going to learn the intimate nuances between each of these types of limudim and how you can diffuse them. So Zog to Gemara, Amar Ravashi, Mishum Dikal Meimar, Nevela Techiach, Shasur B'Achila Muteres B'Hanaa. So Amar Lei Rav Mordechai Ravashi, Hachi Amrino Mishmei Shlosh. I want to tell you a yesodistic rule that we learned from Shlosh about how these limudim work. Kol ma'atzad migufoi parchinon me'alma loy parchin. Whenever you have a ma'atzad, the only way you could undo a ma'atzad is not by asking nevela techiach, which is a third outside item. Yes, nevela techiach shasur b'achilu muteres b'hanaa could be, but we still could learn from Chometz Pesach combined with Arla. We could still combine those two to teach us that there is an Issur Hanaa, and we can ignore a third party. The only time you could slug up a matzad is if you find something in the matzad itself that's different from the subject that you want to teach to. If you could find a special reason that the matzad shares that does not apply to a basar b'chalav, then you could say it's not a raya. But from the fact that you found some other halacha that doesn't have this rule, that's not an acceptable way to slug up a matzah. So now we learned a new yesod that matzads you can't slug up from a third party. You can only slug it up mineu bay, showing that it has a chumrah that would attribute to, that would be the reason why they have this other chumrah, and therefore that doesn't share that chumrah doesn't have the chumrah of Issur Hanaa. So zok to Gemara, kol ma'atzad migufei parchinon me'alma loy parchinon. So therefore you can't ask me that nevela techia. So if that's the case, we're back to square one. Why did the Gemara need to bring in a third item of Klayim? So the Gemara, ihachi teiti b'matzad. So why taka don't you learn it from a matzad? Why did I need climb? Why couldn't I just use chametz bepesach and orla? Which from the ikal mifrach could I could slug up. I could slug up this matzad. Mal lehatzad hashavish shabehen, meaning chametz bepesach shares a special, unique feature with orla. Shekain gidule kaka. They're both things that grow from the ground. Chametz bepesach is wheat or other grains that grow. Orla something that grows. They share that attribute. Therefore, we would not apply it to Basar b'chalav to say there's an Issur. Now, you might ask me, what type of catch is that? So they're gedula karka. Why would that be a reason to justify Issur or not? That's a factoid that has nothing to do with our discussion. Zok the Gemara, when it comes to a ma'atzad, you could slug it up with a factoid, even though that factoid should have no impact on whether or not there should be an Issur or not. That's rule number 2 about a matzad. So rule number 1 about a matzad is that you could only slaughter up with bay, not from a third item. And second rule we just learned is that you could slug it up with a simple distinction, even though that distinction wouldn't justify not applying that alone. Now I'll share with you another rule that Rish Lakish taught us. Kol ma'atzad parchinon kol dehu. A matzad, you could slug it up with a simple distinction, even though that distinction wouldn't be a good reason as to why the Issur Basar b'chalav should not be Asher Bana and Chametz b'Pesach and Orlo should be Asher Bana. But loyim amrit, just because you said it, just because you could slug up a memetinu with a pircha kol dehu, loyim amrit by chada b'chada. If you're learning one from one with a kal v'chomer, there it's only kal v'chomer perchinon, but kol du loy perch. When it's a kal v'chomer, you have to actually show a reason why the thing that you think is chomer is really kal, and therefore you wouldn't be able to prove it to another item. So now we see a clear distinction in how you diffuse a kal v'chomer. There has to be a good logical argument why the chomer should only apply to A and not to B. But if it's a memetinu and you're learning b'shutz of some 2 things, then you just have to find some distinction, even though the distinction wouldn't explain why Chametz b'Pesach and Orla should have the Chumrah of Issur and Basar b'chalav. Frank the Gemara b'lifroich l'chulu. So now that you have the third item, Klayim, how does that help? You can still ask the same question. Klayim is gedula karka, Orla is gedula karka, Chametz b'Pesach is gedula karka, and Basar b'chalav isn't. So you still have the same kasha. B'lifroich l'chulu. So why can't you slug up the triumvirate, the 3 items that we want to learn from, plug it up also with a simple question? So it's Dr. Gemara. Now we're going to teach you a third rule when it comes to these things. This is what we learned, a third rule in the name of Rish Lakish, turning on the Kuf Tez Zayin Amud Aleph. If it's a kal v'chomer, you need to find a good reason why the chomer should apply here and not there. But kol du loy perchinon, you can't just point out a difference that doesn't have an impact. If you're learning 1 from 2, meaning a typical memetinu from 2 together, afilu kol du perchinon, then you can ask any distinction would diffuse that matzah. But chada mitlas, once you add klayim to the group of Orla and Korban Pesach, then ihadur dina v'asi b'matzad parchinon kol du. If you're still only learning from 2 things, then you can ask any question. You can't ask Tamakacha. The fact that it's merely Gidule Karka, which has no impact on whether or not it should be Yosy or not, that you can't ask Makasha when you're learning from 3 together. Okay, we'll stop here, Rez Hashem, and tomorrow we'll pick up a Daf Kuf Tesai. Go ahead.